these notes, I can give them to John, I'll put them up on the website. People that are pro-K also have an interpretation of resolved, otherwise they probably lose a lot. So, number one definition of resolved on the American Heritage Dictionary says to make a firm decision about. And so, a lot of people argue that, well, all I have to do with the word resolved is make a firm decision about the resolution. I don't have to enact a policy or anything. So, K debaters also argue that because the word resolved comes before the colon in the resolution, that it indicates that debaters are resolved, colon, making a statement about a firm decision about the resolution. This interpretation is up for grabs. I've seen stacks of evidence either way on whether or not the colon and its relationship to the topic and its relationship to the word resolved has any meaning. You can argue that it has meaning to the debaters because it comes before, and so it's like, as the speaking subject, I'm saying, me and my partner, or sorry, I am resolved, colon, then we'll make the statement. There's also definitions of resolved that say if the word following the if the sentence following or preceding the colon is short, and the real meaning of the sentence after the colon is capitalized, like the United States federal government usually is, then the real business of the sentence is what comes after the colon. And so that's another argument that policy-only advocates like to use in response to this argument. But like I said, if the word resolved is up for debate, and if the relationship of the colon to the topic is up for debate, you can understand that all of these things, it's probably a good idea to have evidence on all of these questions, and at least a defense of what you think these things are. Should is another question that is commonly contrasted in K debates. Anti-K debaters think that should implies a choice between two policy options or the status quo. K debaters, especially when running ethics Ks, argue that their interpretation of should be ought to, or implies some sort of moral obligation. So once again, if should is up for grabs, you should probably have evidence on your interpretation of this question. Performance. All right, tell a little story. 2007 Northwestern, round 6 versus Idaho GK. I was very tired. It's very cold in Northwestern. It was snowing. I don't like snow. I had 7 tubs, and we had to walk around downtown Chicago because Northwestern's campus, the buildings that they use on campus is in Evanston was under construction. So we had to be in downtown Chicago. So we're going from like random law building here to 4 blocks over here, carrying 7 tubs in the snow. And so I was angry. And I go in, I set up all my tubs, and I leave to go smoke a cigarette. And I come back, and there's just one guy in there. It's the one guy from the other team. I can't remember if it was D or K. I think it was K. But he's just sitting there chilling, setting up his tubs too. And I leave, go smoke my cigarette. I come back in. Everybody's in there. The judge is there. My partner's sitting at my desk just looking at me. And I look over, and there's this dude standing at the podium dressed in the Cat in the Hat suit. Like, full out. He's got a tail, full costume, giant hat. And I'm like, damn it, this is going to be confusing. And so he starts reading his argument. He gets out Barbie dolls, like, and these are Bush and Condi, and they start talking about terrorists and using puppets, and I have no idea what's going on. And by the time CrossX gets here, we're like, what was that? And they're like, what do you mean, what was that? I'm like, do you defend the resolution? Because the resolution was resolved the Supreme Court should overrule one or more of these following cases. And they're like, what's the resolution? I'm like, resolved the Supreme Court should overrule one or more of these following cases. And they go, well, that's not the resolution we came to debate. And they get a big pink ball, like, you know those pink balls in Walmart that are in those big things with the stretchy things, right? A big pink ball that has the resolution on it. And they're like, this is the resolution. And I'm like, really? All right, so if that's the resolution, what ground do we get? And they're like, well, I don't really care what ground you take. And they get out this big piece of string, and they wrap it around their desk. This is our ground. You can have all the ground outside. And I'm like, all right, damn. And so eventually, we figure out that they're reading an overglorified argument about Nietzsche's play. And so we finally figured that out after it being really frustrating, and we came up with a strategy based off that argument. But the moral of that story is that these crazy performance teams usually have some argument that they're trying to talk about. This argument was about Nietzsche's concept of play. We caught on to that, answered it, won. Second story, Georgia State versus Louisville RW. Louisville likes to talk about how we should renounce our black privilege, and because they're black, we should vote for them. I think that argument's kind of silly, and it's kind of arbitrary. So this time they were talking about how we should use Aristotle's three-tiered methods of ethos, pathos, and logos as a mechanism for evaluating our argument. But this wasn't very clear until the end of their speech. For a lot of part of their speech, they were playing music, they were rapping, they were telling personal stories about all of these things, and they were also using logical appeals. But their trick is that they're like, listen, they're policy debaters, they're probably going to out-tech us on the logos, so we're going to win ethos and pathos. And so instead of answering their argument, we ran a criticism of Aristotelian rhetoric, and that was one way of answering their argument. So the moral of the story is don't freak out. They have a message or a philosophy behind them, usually, unless they're just doing like Dada, which is just nonsense. So figure it out, think, read, answer. These mean that's that same formula for answering all types of critiques. And, of course, I wouldn't be holding myself if Judy Butler did not get the almost last word. I'm going to talk about the NFA loophole real quick. But this is from Judith Butler's Precarious Life, and it's probably one of the best framework cards that's utilized in the pro-K-camp formula. And so we're going to talk about what it means for a second. Dissent and debate depend upon the inclusion of those who maintain critical views of state policy and civic culture, remaining part of the larger public discussion and the value of policies and politics. To charge those who voice critical views with treason, terrorist sympathizing, anti-Semitism, moral relativism, postmodernism, juvenile behavior, collaboration, and anachronistic leftism is to seek to destroy the credibility not of the views that are held, but of the persons who hold them. It produces a climate of fear into which the voice of a certain view is to risk being branded and shamed with a heinous appellation. Dissent is quelled in part through threatening the speaking subject with an uninhabitable identification. Because it would be heinous to identify as treasonous or as a collaborator, one fails to speak, or one speaks in throttled ways in order to sidestep the terrorizing identification that threatens to take hold. The strategy for quelling dissent and limiting the reach of critical debate happens not only through a series of shaming tactics, which have a certain psychological terrorization as their effect, but they work as well by producing what will and will not count as a viable speaking subject and a reasonable opinion within the public domain. It is precisely because one does not want to lose one's status as a viable speaking being that one does not say what one thinks. Under social conditions that regulate identifications and the sense of viability to this degree, censorship operates implicitly and forcefully. The line that circumscribes what is speakable and what is livable also functions as an instrument of censorship. To decide what views will count as reasonable within the public domain, however, is to decide what will and will not count as the public sphere of debate. And if someone holds views that are not in line with the nationalist norm, that person comes to lack credibility as a speaking person, and the media is not open to him or her approval. The foreclosure of critique empties the public domain of debate and democratic contestation itself, so that debate becomes the exchange of the views among the like-minded, and criticism, which ought to be subject and central to any democracy, becomes a fugitive and suspect activity. So I think that's a phenomenal answer to these arguments and a reason to not shift them off or say that they don't belong here or that these type of arguments do violence to this. Because in reality, everything is debatable. Everything we talk about in debate is debatable. That's one of the beautiful things about this activity as compared to the classroom, is that you all get to take these things and ideas and make them their own. So I encourage you to, instead of freak out and try to tell K debaters that they can't do what they're doing, is to just answer their arguments. Because really, they're just making arguments about the general things that you take for granted are not, should not be taken for granted. Unless specifically identified as a key issue in the resolution. I said I was going to talk about this later. I think that a resolution that requires a revaluation of the United States' pseudo-democratic, pseudo-free market economic system with Cuba's socialist government economic system mandates a discussion of the form of government and the economic system of each country. So I don't think you're going to have a hard time winning this argument. I think discussions about whether or not a Cuba, Venezuela, China,